this video, we're diving into why all professional photographers crop their images and why I wish I would have learned this sooner. And if you've taken photos recently that were almost awesome, but you haven't managed to put your finger on that final element that makes them really stand out, well, stick around because I'm going to share 5 game-changing cropping tips that are going to help your photos go from good to great. I've also got a bonus tip at the end of this video that's going to stop you going too far with all of this cropping and ruining your photos. So make sure you stick around for that. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Isn't cropping cheating? Shouldn't we try and get the perfect composition in camera? Well, trust me, I used to think exactly the same thing, but let me tell you, as an amateur landscape photographer who's still figuring these things out, cropping has become my secret tool, and I'm betting by the end of this video, it's going to become yours as well. So let's get into it. When I first started out with photography, I would always put my subject smack bang in the middle of my frame. I mean, literally, when you're looking around, you're looking at stuff in real life, that's what you do, right? But here is the thing, whilst putting your subject in the middle of the frame can work sometimes, it can often lead to pretty boring photos, and that's where cropping comes in. Think of cropping like having a second chance at getting the right composition. You can move your subject around the frame without having to reshoot the entire thing. It's like magic. And let me give you a real life example. So I took this photo of a lone tree at sunset, and in my original shot, the tree was smack bang in the center of the photo. It's fine, but it didn't really capture the mood that I was going for. But when I cropped it, I put the tree off to one side, I cut out the little bit of tarn that was on the left of the shot, I eliminated some of the more boring hill elements on the right-hand side, and I balanced the image out, with the sunset having as much of a balance visually as the tree in the frame. And I think it looks better than what it did originally. You can think of it like rearranging furniture in a room. You wouldn't put everything in the center, right? That would be odd. You'd spread things out in the room to create a nice flow, a nice visual flow, and it's the same with your photos. Now, there's this thing, you've probably heard of it, the rule of thirds. It's like a tic-tac-toe grid for your photos. And the idea behind the rule of thirds is to place your main subject along one of those lines or at one of those points of intersection. So when you're cropping your photos, try to keep this in mind. It can make a huge difference to how impactful your photo is. But here's the cool thing. Once you understand these rules, you can also then go and intentionally break them for effect. Sometimes a dead center composition can be super powerful. The key is to make it a conscious choice, not just the default thing that you do every time you pick up the camera or you crop a photo. So the next time you're editing your photos, try moving your subject around within the frame, crop it a bunch of different ways and see how it changes the feel of the image. You might be surprised at just how much impact a simple crop like this can have on the image. But a good photo isn't just about looking pretty. It's about how much attention it demands from the viewer. So let's jump into that next. So, you know when you take a photo and it looks amazing on the back of your camera screen, but when you get home, you look at it on the computer and you go, that's not actually that good at all. I've been there more times than I'd like to admit. But here's the thing, often it's not that the photo is bad, it's just that there's too much stuff going on within it. Think of it like this. Have you ever tried to have a conversation with someone at a busy party? Well, it's hard to focus, right? There's too much stuff going on, and this can happen with our photos as well. And this is where cropping comes in. You can use cropping to essentially turn down the music and everyone else shouting and screaming at that party so you can actually hear what your friend is saying. By cropping out the distractions, you're essentially telling the viewer, hey, this is what I want you to look at. Focus in on this one section of the frame. Now, let me give you an example. The other day, I was trying to cram all of this within my shot. Some foreground, 2 lakes, 2 mountains, and it was a bit of a mess because I was trying to be greedy to capture everything that was in the scene in front of me. So I repositioned myself slightly, I waited for the light, and then the most important thing that changed this photograph and made it not crap and something that I kind of proud of, right, is that I opened Photoshop and I turned it from a landscape photo into a portrait photo and just cropped the heck out of it. And it turned out like this. Now, would it have been better to have made these changes in camera rather than Photoshop? Absolutely. Without the hefty crop, I would have had way more megapixels to play with, for example, but let's be real here, and especially for any landscape photographers who are watching this. Sometimes I'm just trying to capture that moment or that minuscule 3 seconds of light before it's gone. And that's where cropping after the fact can save the day. So next time you're looking at a photo and thinking, it's not quite right, try cropping out some of the distractions and you might be surprised how much it improves your image. But here's a question for you. Have you ever cropped a photo and felt like it completely transformed your image? Drop a comment below and let me know. I'd love to hear about your cropping success stories. All right, let's dive into something that sounds a little bit fancy, but it's actually really simple and effective, and that's using leading lines in your cropping. Leading lines. Well, don't worry if you're not familiar with the term. I didn't know what it meant when I first started out either. Well, leading lines are basically any lines in your photo that lead your viewer's eye to the main subject within the frame. It could be a road, a fence, the edge of a building, it doesn't really matter. And here's the cool part. You can use cropping to emphasize these lines and make your photos way more impactful. Now you might be thinking, Will, what the heck has leading lines got to do with cropping, the whole point of this video? Well, I don't know if it's just me being dim, right? Or if I just don't take enough time to line up my shots properly in the field. Or maybe, and I've thought about this before, it could be because I wear glasses that I sometimes struggle to get my eyeball close enough to the viewfinder to really see everything that's going on within the frame and how it's all lined up. But sometimes I see the leading lines in the scene, but I don't quite capture them in the direction or at the angle that I would really like to within my photo. If you've ever had this issue, don't worry, you can correct some of this with a crop in post-production. And here's a little trick that I like to do when I'm editing my photos and I'm thinking about leading lines. When I'm cropping, I like to imagine little tiny arrows along all of the leading lines of every part of the image. And then I like to crop the image so that those lines point to what I want them to go towards. If they're all pointing towards your subject, you're golden, no worries. If not, perhaps resize the image with a crop to cut out any leading lines that are pointing away from your subject and just clean it up a little bit. Now, you don't always have obvious leading lines like a wall to work with. Sometimes it's more subtle, the curve of a coastline, the angle of a person's gaze, even the way that tree branches are arranged. The key is to experiment here and see what works. And the best part, once you start looking for leading lines when you're editing and cropping your photos, you're going to see more of these leading lines when you take photos in the first place. It's like unlocking a secret level in the game of photography. So next time you're editing your photos, take a moment to look for any of those leading lines that could guide your viewer's eye towards your subject, or crop out the ones that are leading away from it. Okay, so let's talk about something that can really take your photos to the next level, using cropping to create a sense of movement and energy in your images. This is especially useful when you're photographing anything that's, well, moving, right? But as I'm going to show you in a second, this can also add a dynamic feel to any still subjects that you'd like to give the perception of movement to as well. So here's the deal. When you've got a moving subject, leave some empty space in the direction that they're heading. And this can make your photos feel a little bit more alive. It's like giving your subject room to breathe, or room to move, or room to navigate. And this cropping technique works with all kinds of subjects. People running, cars driving, even something as simple as a bird in flight. By giving your subject space to move into, you're inviting the viewer's imagination to take over and to continue the action beyond the frame. And even for static subjects as well, where there is no movement, but you might want to give it the perception of movement. Let's say you've taken a portrait of a person and they are facing right. Well, if you leave a little bit more space on the right side of the frame, it's like you're laying out a red carpet for your subject to strut their stuff. Even if the person isn't moving, the viewer is going to feel like they may move in the not too distant future in that direction. Leaving some space on the side of the frame where a person is looking can also create a sense that that individual is looking at something as well, even if the thing that they're looking at is not captured within the frame. And for me personally, I have to use this all of the time. If I'm photographing something like wildlife, a bird, my dog running around, whatever it is, 100% of my concentration in the moment is making sure that that animal is in focus and is actually in the frame altogether. I'm not really focusing about the composition. I don't have the brain computational energy to do so. And for me, it's much more important to grab a sharp image that can be cropped rather than missing the shot altogether by trying to get the composition perfect in camera instead. And we're going to cover something else that I personally struggle with in the next point. It sounds so simple, but aspect ratios. I still need to work on this myself, right? This is because almost every single photograph that I shoot is a landscape 4:3. Why? Because that's the aspect ratio of all the picture frames in my house. Now, I like to print my work, stick it on the wall, wait for people to comment on it, and, you know, rarely does anyone even notice that I put a new photograph on the wall. Maybe this dude in the comments was right all along. Anyway, an aspect ratio is just a relationship between the width and the height of your photo. Most cameras shoot in either 3:2 or 4:3, but here's the kicker. You don't have to stick with that. Cropping lets you play around with different ratios to find out what works for your individual photo. Now, when I first started out, I thought I had to keep every photo in its original ratio. But I soon discovered the joy of experimenting, and a whole new world of cropping aspect ratios opened up to me. Let me give you a real life example. So when I chopped off the bottom of this image, which put it at some random aspect ratio that there will be no, unless I custom build one, there'll be no frame that'll fit it, I think the photo looked actually much, much better. Now, I couldn't really zoom in and cut out the dead space at the bottom of the frame, as the foreground rock and the lake are already right on the sides of the frame and they would have got cut off. So cropping the bottom of the frame, turning it into some random aspect ratio was the only way to improve that particular photo. And cropping your images to change aspect ratios is like having a wardrobe full of different outfits that you can put on your photos. Sometimes a photo is going to look best in its original aspect ratio. Sometimes it wants to be tall and skinny. Sometimes it wants to be wide and expansive. The fun part is figuring out which outfit, so to speak, fits the photo best. And here is a quick pro tip. Many social media platforms prefer specific aspect ratios. Instagram, for example, loves a 4:5 vertical ratio for posts. So if you're planning on sharing your photos online and you want them to actually get seen by people and you want to tap into all the algorithms, that's a different video for a different time, whether you should be bothered about that at all. I'm not, you probably shouldn't be, but keep these preferred ratios in mind when you are cropping. But remember, there are no hard and fast rules here. The right aspect ratio is the one that makes your specific photo look best to you. So don't be afraid to play around and just see what works. All right, so we made it to the bonus tip that I promised you at the beginning of the video, and here it is. Don't overdo it with your cropping. I know. After this whole video about how great cropping is, I'm telling you not to do it too much in this bonus tip. But hear me out, because when I first discovered the power of cropping, I went a little bit cropping crazy. I was cropping everything so tight that the few wildlife photos that I was taking looked like mugshots, just zoomed in right on the bird or my dog's face. I've got a few photos lying around somewhere. You can't even tell what animal it is anymore because I've zoomed in so far in the crop. Not to mention all of the noise and the grain that starts showing up when you get that close into an image, no matter what the resolution of the camera is. And here's the thing, while cropping can be a powerful tool, it's not the answer to everything. Sometimes the environment around a subject is just as important as the subject itself. It provides context, it tells a story, and it can make your images so much more interesting. Think of it like this, if you're telling a story about going to the beach, the story isn't, well, I looked at the ground and I saw some sand. No, you're going to talk about the waves, the seagull stealing your ice cream, maybe the sandcastle that you built, all of the little details. They're all the things that make the story come alive. And it's the same for your photos. Sure, you want your subject to stand out. You want to have a main focal point most of the time within most types of photography. But don't be afraid to give some breathing room. Show us where they are, what's happening around them. That's often where the magic happens. And if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to continue improving your photography skills, why not click the video that's on the screen right now?